Hello, this is Stuart Bray and thank you for watching this DVD. Sculpt Gel is a silicone paste which can be modelled and used directly on the skin surface to create long-lasting and realistic makeup effects. Think of the convenience of wax, traditional scar wax, combined with many of the benefits of silicone-filled appliances. Now you can use this stuff to create gory gunshot wounds and subtle kind of scars and veins. There's a huge range of things you can do with this material. And in this first chapter of the DVD, we're going to go through the skills and techniques and methods to use this stuff well. And then the other 3 chapters are going to be 15 different makeup effects, which I'm going to take you through step by step using these techniques. So let's get started. The beauty of Sculpt Gel is its simplicity. It comes in a kit of 3 parts labelled A, B and C. In order to use it, you mix equal amounts of A and B thoroughly and apply. This will set in approximately 5 to 10 minutes and it remains flexible like skin. Now by adding part C when you mix, you can actually make the material even softer. This is great for areas of skin where more flexibility is required, such as the neck or where the skin can stretch more, or even for squidgy, fatty tissues in open wounds. Incidentally, adding part C will extend the working time. In this video, I'll be taking a look at changing the colour of Sculpt Gel 2, which is currently available in 3 different coloured kits. There's clear for you to add your own colour, a light flesh tone kit, and a dark flesh tone kit. All kits can be tinted at the mixing stage to better match the skin. The cured Sculpt Gel can then be made up and dressed as necessary to complete the effect. We'll look at the best ways to achieve this and how to get the colour right. Sculpt Gel should be stored with the lids on, and care should be taken to ensure that the lids go back on the same containers and do not get mixed up. It's a good idea to mark the lids before you use them to avoid confusion and to get into the habit of replacing lids immediately after use. Sculpt Gel contains no water and won't dry out, but keeping lids on will stop moisture and mess from the environment from getting into the pots. Store Sculpt Gel away from extremes of temperature, as this can affect the material performance. Heat, for example, will accelerate the cure or setting time, and cold will extend it, so be aware of this should the material be exposed to a warm or cool environment. Incidentally, if you ever need to increase the working time of Sculpt Gel, it's a good idea to put the containers with the lids on in a refrigerator for 30 minutes or so before use to cool them down. If where you're working is a very cold environment and you actually need more heat to set the thing off quicker, you can use a blow dryer in a warm setting to accelerate the cure. Let's take a quick look at how the mixture changes as it sets up over time. Here I measure out equal amounts of parts A, B and C from the flesh kit with a room temperature of approximately 20 degrees Celsius, which is about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Once I've mixed them thoroughly together, you can see that I'm still able to move the mixture for about 4 or 5 minutes. After 7 minutes, it begins to thicken up. You can see the tool marks here are becoming more obvious. After 10 minutes, it's thicker still and continues to thicken until at about 15 minutes, it's completely set. And now the material is set, has a memory of the shape that it's set into, and it springs back when pressed, just like real skin. So now we've seen how the stuff mixes and how it goes off, let's take a quick look at some of the things you'll need in order to make the best use of the material. Obviously, the first thing on your list will be a Sculpt Gel kit, either a clear, flesh or dark flesh kit, whichever best suits your needs. Once you have your Sculpt Gel kit, you'll need something to mix on. This just needs to be a clean, non-porous surface such as a tile, a plastic lid or some furniture board. Artist tear-off palettes are ideal, as is some grease-proof baking paper or baking parchment. If it's too flimsy, tear a piece off and staple it to some card to stop it from folding around. You'll need a tool to mix and apply. Ideally, a flat-bladed palette knife, a spatula or sculpting tool is best. However, wooden coffee stirrers or these wooden waxing spatulas will do just as well. Some surgical spirit or isopropyl alcohol, sometimes known as 99% alcohol, which is useful for smoothing out the surface and adding texture. It's also used to thin makeup, which you may need to blend in the effect. such as grease paint or alcohol activated colours like Skin Illustrator or these Mold Life colours. Obviously, take appropriate precautions when dealing with solvents which are flammable and have flammable fumes. You'll need to make sure you work in a well-ventilated area, and of course make sure there are no naked flames or cigarettes or candles or anything like that when you're working with this. If you want to pre-colour the Sculpt Gel to match the skin, you'll need to add some silicone pigments. These concentrated liquid pigments are very strong, and you'll only need a tiny amount. So it's a good idea to wear some disposable vinyl gloves like these to protect your hands. You can also use flocking to help create a realistic skin tone. Flock is small fibres, usually a synthetic material such as nylon, and it's available in various colours and different lengths. When added and mixed into a translucent material such as Sculpt Gel, it creates a subtle mottle of colours which looks more like real skin. This is very effective in creating the natural mottling you see in normal skin. You can see here on my own hand that the skin is not one single colour, but made up of a subtle layers of colours including reds, yellows and green. I've upped the kind of contrast in Photoshop just to show you where the mottling is happening if it's not obvious. You can see here now that it's a little more extreme, just to kind of show you where the mottling is, and when I drop back down to the normal tone you can see more obviously where these mottles are. And it's that kind of natural breakup of colour that is going to make your final makeup look more like real skin. In terms of colours of flocking, I recommend that you get the 3 primaries, that's a blue, a red and a yellow, plus a brown if you can, and a green, which is very good at neutralising reds. So if you find you've got a mix that's looking too pink or too red, a little bit of green in there can kind of help even it out. You may want to use makeup for a perfect match with the surrounding skin. Now, I recommend, ideally if you can, trying to get some alcohol activated colours like Skin Illustrator or these Life Colour palettes by Mold Life. Alternatively, a grease paint palette such as this 12 colour Super Colour palette by Krylon is also very good. It doesn't cost too much by professional makeup standards, and I'm going to use these more in the colouring technique chapter, so you'll see how to use these with alcohol a little bit later. Some sponge is very useful too. Nothing special, just a bath sponge or some upholstery foam is ideal. If you can get some from an upholsterer's, that's very good. Upholsterers often cut and shape foam to fit sort of seats and chairs and stuff, and very often they'll have sort of odd shaped offcuts that they will either throw away or recycle. Because you don't need beautiful sponge for this kind of stuff, if you can get a big bag of that, you can probably get it for nothing or for a lot less than you would pay for a professional makeup sponge. So try and get your sponge from an upholsterer's if you can, and tearing it into pieces is better than cutting with scissors, as the resulting texture will create a more realistic finish when we use it. Sculpt Gel can be a little shiny once set, although texturing with a sponge will help this a lot, but to reduce it entirely you want to use some kind of makeup anti-shine or some kind of translucent talc, makeup talc, to take the shine away. Now, I don't use expensive makeup brushes at all. This is because I need to apply colours in a natural looking, broken up way, so I much prefer these cheap artist brushes which I just stamp out on a tabletop to make them flare out like this. And using these, I can apply a very natural looking washes of colour without destroying or worrying about breaking up any of my beautiful makeup brushes. So I use art brushes from an art store for these. A few disposable cups are very handy for putting your surgical spirit in and for storing any custom mixed colours that you may have made. They can also easily be cut down like this to make shallow dishes for alcohol. Sometimes when you're using just a little bit of alcohol in a cup, it's very easy to knock a tall cup over. So if you can cut it down, you've basically got a little dish which is much less likely to get knocked over. Lastly, it's likely you're going to need some fake blood at some point. Good bloods should not only look real, but also clean off skin easily and not leave any kind of stain. Now, there are various kinds, there's many different brands of blood, so you don't need gallons of the stuff. I would suggest just getting a small bottle of the best that you can afford. If you're using a flesh tone kit or a dark flesh tone kit and the Sculpt Gel that you've got is a colour close enough for what you need, then you can skip past this bit on mixing pigments. However, if you need to mix pigment to get a closer match, then let's take a look at how best to go about doing it. Using ready mixed flesh pigments will save you from having to mix one from scratch and speeds things up quite a bit. However, they can be modified for a closer match by adding little bits of raw colour. In terms of what colours to buy, pigment brands vary, but I would suggest getting at least one pre-mixed Caucasian flesh tone, plus white, red, yellow, blue, brown and black. These 7 colours can be combined to create almost any skin tone base. For example, starting with a pre-mixed flesh, you can lighten it further by adding white. The resulting colour can then be made pinker with red, or deadened using blue to reduce the orange. Adding more brown to the base obviously makes it darker, and again by modifying these colours with small amounts of the necessary pigment, you can tweak them to suit the desired tone. If it needs reddening, for example, this is easily done. And you can warm this colour up further by adding yellow too. So you can see combining just these 7 pigments will give you a huge range. By carefully mixing and experimenting with small amounts at first, you should be able to get a close enough match. It helps to offer up the pigment to the skin that you're trying to match, so you can more clearly see what needs to be added. If you are not familiar with mixing colours and colour theory, a colour wheel like this will help you decide what colours you need to adjust your base tone. If you'd like a colour wheel, just pause and print this one, or find one on Google. The primary colours are on the left, and they're the starting block colours. You can't mix these colours, you can't create them by mixing other colours together. These, as the name suggests, are primary colours, they're the base colours. Mixing 2 primaries together will create what's known as a secondary colour, and these are on the right hand side. Adding white to these colours will create paler tints, and adding black will create darker shades of these colours. Now what is useful to know on a colour wheel is that the opposing colours, the opposite colours, will actually neutralise each other. For example, if your base colour is a little bit too red, then adding just a touch of green will actually fix that. If your base colour is too orange, then adding a tiny bit of blue can take the orangeness out, just as a drop of purple can subdue something which is too yellow. Now when you're doing this, you'll only need the tiniest amount of pigment usually. If they're very, very strong pigments, it's possible to overdo it, so just be very cautious and add tiny amounts at a time. You can always add more, but you can't subtract it once you've mixed it in. So once you're happy with your colour, keep your mixed custom colour safe in a cup or a similar container until you're ready to use it, and then you can add tiny amounts to your Sculpt Gel mix as required. Now this pigment is not actually paint, it won't dry out, there's no water involved in here, it's an oil based material. So keep it covered to keep mess from getting into it, but it doesn't need to be airtight. I bought these little plastic pots with screw-on lids really cheap from a container supplier online. Here's my pre-mixed pigment safely contained. Once you've mixed up your pure silicone pigment to your liking, you now need to add tiny bits of it to your Sculpt Gel mix. The key with pigments is to add tiny amounts at a time and mix them thoroughly. Remember, you can always add more, but you can't take any out. If you add too little pigment to your Sculpt Gel, then the material looks too translucent and wax-like, not like real skin. So here the pigment used in this mix is a good colour, but there's not enough of it in the mix, so it results in it being too translucent. And if you add too much pigment, then it looks flat and opaque, which again doesn't look like real skin. Here the mix is just right. I simply added small amounts of pigment until I arrived at the correct opacity. Now it's quite nice once you've added your pigment to add a little bit of flock to the mix as well, just to tweak the colour, and it gives it a slight breakup of colour, and the flock remain visible as tiny little particles. So if you need to redden the mixture, for example, then perhaps try adding a little red flock instead of red pigment. Here you can see just how much the flock can do. The mixture on the left is Sculpt Gel tinted only with pigments. And even though the colour is close, it's a flat single colour throughout the whole mix, unlike my skin. Contrast this same mixture with a little bit of red flock added on the right hand side and you can see that it matches the skin a lot more. Of course, you can do a great deal when applying makeup after the material is cured, and if you're doing an injury effect, there's likely to be blood and stuff all over it, which may obscure much of the skin anyway. Now, instead of just mixing up pure pigment, you could actually use the pigment you've mixed up to pre-colour a clear Sculpt Gel kit if you pigment the individual components. Remember that Sculpt Gel only sets when A and B are mixed together, but you could individually pigment some part A, some part B and part C separately, and then keep them safe in a clean container until you need them. And when you're ready to use them, you take out whatever you need, and each mix that you make will be the same colour every time, and that'll save you a lot of time and hassle, and it's very good for continuity. These pots, for example, are now the right colour for Sam, and they can sit in these pots for months without going off, and whenever I'm ready to use them, I can just take a scoop out, use them and mix them up, and they'll be the right colour. So let's take a look at how Sculpt Gel can be used to make realistic looking wounds. Sculpt Gel will stick best to clean skin, so it's a good idea to clean it just before you're ready to mix the Sculpt Gel. Use a good makeup remover and a mild astringent to prepare the skin, and make sure that you don't apply anything to sore or broken skin. When you start out, I suggest using small amounts and make little effects until you get familiar with the material. It's much cheaper to make your mistakes using a tiny bit of material rather than half a kit. Okay, so I first need to mix up enough Sculpt Gel to create a wound. Now after a few mixes it becomes easier to estimate the required amounts, but if you're in doubt of how much you need, do a slightly smaller mix because you can always mix up more and add it later. And measure out equal amounts of part A and part B, making sure to clean the tool between the two pots to avoid contamination. I decide to add the same amount of part C to make this mix a little bit softer. The more part C you add, the softer the mix will become. Once all the scoops are placed close together on a palette, I mix them all together. Now it's important to mix thoroughly, otherwise it may not cure properly. It makes sense to mix as quickly as you can, because once you start mixing, the clock is ticking. So once you've mixed, apply the Sculpt Gel into place quickly. And when it's on the skin where you need it, the edges should be quickly smoothed out and blended using a tool. As you saw before, you usually have at least a couple of minutes working time depending on the ambient temperature of where you're working. You should have plenty of time to smooth it out, but if you forget and leave it too long, then you're going to have trouble smoothing it out easily because as it starts to thicken, it becomes kind of cheesier in texture. And if you try and smooth out the edges at this point, then you're going to leave tool marks. To demonstrate what happens if you leave it too long, I've allowed another test mix here of Sculpt Gel to set up too much before I started smoothing it out. And you can see that it goes all kind of sticky and horrible and it just leaves tool marks and texture everywhere. That's not what you want. If it gets to this point before you start smoothing it out, then you've left it too long. You'll have to clean it off and go over again. Be aware that the heat of the skin can speed things up, so the curing can always happen a little bit quicker on the skin than it can on the palette you've mixed it. So you want to try and smooth this out as quickly as you can. And the idea is to blend these edges out so that they disappear into the surrounding skin without leaving a noticeable edge. And a common mistake that people make is to build it up too thickly. Now the amount of overall thickness you need obviously depends on the effect you're trying to achieve. But the thicker you build it up, naturally the more obvious it's going to be that there's something stuck on the surface of the skin. So to help demonstrate this, let's imagine that this illustration is some skin seen from side on in cross section, and I apply a blob of Sculpt Gel and blend the edges out. Now if I've built it up too thickly, you can see that the angle of the blended edge is quite steep from the side. It looks like a flash volcano sticking out from the skin. It just looks fake. Here you can see that actually using less blends in much more convincingly. I actually kept a Sculpt Gel wound which was peeled off, and I've cut it in half so that you can see the thickness and how wide it is to create a gentle angle which is much less obvious on the skin. So when you're smoothing your edges out, sometimes you need to press quite firmly on the skin to flatten the edge out, so you create a nice gradual ramp from the skin up to the sort of desired thickness of the Sculpt Gel. Now try and do this in smooth, long wiping motions along the edge, as this will leave the fewest tool marks. Now once you've smoothed out the edge, resist the temptation to keep messing with it. Leave it to thicken and allow it to start setting up. Remember that once you've smoothed it out, you can speed up the setting with a hairdryer on a warm setting, just to kind of speed things along. Now as the mixture starts setting, you can begin to add a skin texture. A generic skin texture will help the surface look more real, as well as reduce the shine. And the easiest way to give some texture is to use a small piece of torn sponge. Now you can use a bath sponge or upholstery foam like I am here. It doesn't need to be a special expensive makeup sponge. And as I said before, tearing it as opposed to cutting it with scissors will leave a much more natural, rougher kind of surface, which better suits the texture that we want to create on the Sculpt Gel. So take your piece of sponge and dip it in some surgical spirit or alcohol and gently stipple the surface of the setting Sculpt Gel. The alcohol or the surgical spirit, they're not going to affect the Sculpt Gel in any way. But what it does do is it stops it from sticking to the sponge. So you can gradually increase the texture by sort of stippling the surface without actually grabbing at the sponge. If you're using alcohol or surgical spirit, be careful near the eyes, nose or the mouth, as the smell can be very strong. So be sensible, use as little as you can and fan away the fumes. If you find that your sponge has got too much in it, then squeeze it out and sort of dry it onto a bit of tissue so that there's less in there. You only need a little bit just to stop it from sticking. As your Sculpt Gel begins to set up, the texture will remain and you can gradually nudge out any tool marks or lines which look unnatural. So just keep doing this, and if you want to, you can gently heat the surface with a hairdryer to accelerate the setting. If the colour and the opacity is close to the skin, then having done your texturing with a sponge, 90% of the work is done. It's very important to do the sponging. If you have smooth, untextured Sculpt Gel, it tends to set naturally to a very smooth and shiny finish. But even if you have sponged the surface to create your texture, sometimes you may find it still a little bit shiny. If this is the case, you can use either a little bit of powder on a powder puff or an anti-shine if you like, once it's set, to try and get rid of that shine. So just before it totally sets up is the time to scoop, carve, drag, tear, snip, or just generally misbehave and rip into your Sculpt Gel surface as it's setting to create the actual damage into the skin that you're after. This is the actual effect that you wanted to create. It's a classic case of misdirection to achieve the illusion. Most of the energy and effort has actually gone into blending the patch of material to match the skin around it, just so that it's not so evident. When you've taken care of that, then adding this damage in the middle, which is the reason for doing the effect, that's actually much easier and doesn't take as much work because you've made everything else look like it's supposed to be there. And it's this thing that most people will notice in the middle, but they don't notice the far trickier work of blending the edges out into the skin. They're focusing on the damage in the middle. You can see here that I occasionally spray some alcohol on the surface. This is just because it allows me to work the Sculpt Gel without it sticking to the tool. As the Sculpt Gel sets more and more, when you move it around, it starts to behave more like skin. And I can still do more sponging as it sets up, reducing the shine gradually more and more as I do it. I think it's better to try and reduce the shine if you can by sponging. You can also nudge and neaten the edges of the laceration so that they appear crisper and less rounded than they were earlier when the Sculpt Gel was still quite liquid. And doing these little touches really help make the effect work. And it's by doing the right thing at the right time during that setting process which is the key to using Sculpt Gel successfully. Sculpt Gel itself is very durable, and the material, once it's cured, is not damaged by heat or moisture. So depending on the punishment it's exposed to, what can happen is the actual edges themselves will be damaged or could lift. Thin edges that have simply lifted up can be restuck using a little bit of a silicone adhesive such as Telesis 5 or Snappy G. If the edges are really badly damaged, then it may be that they need to be sort of snipped off and then just filled with a little bit more Sculpt Gel, because Sculpt Gel will stick to itself. Assuming the surface is clean, you can mix up a little bit more Sculpt Gel and literally just kind of trowel it onto that the little edge that you've got there, just like if you were filling a hole in a wall with plaster. The difference being that the filler here in this case is flexible and will move with the skin, and once it's set you can then just colour it and make it up as normal. Ideally, the best thing to do is to pre-colour the material itself so it's already similar in tone before you've added any makeup. This is because it minimises the amount of makeup that you'll need to apply to the surface, which keeps the material looking more realistic. Plus, because the colour is inside the Sculpt Gel, it can't rub off or smudge, so you're already kind of ahead of the game if you've got the base colour the right tone. Now, it's important to understand that adding makeup to the surface of Sculpt Gel is a little bit different to normal makeup application. It's the same with prosthetics. You need a different kind of approach to get the colour from the palette or from the brush onto the surface. Make sure you only add makeup once the Sculpt Gel has set, otherwise you may find that you accidentally leave brush marks in the soft surface. Sculpt Gel is essentially a silicone material, so if you apply it using a wiping action like you would on skin to blend colours, it can look odd as the makeup grips the skin in a different way than the silicone, so you can end up actually showing where the edges are by applying makeup incorrectly. The best way to make up Sculpt Gel is to use either alcohol activated makeup such as Skin Illustrators or these Mold Life Life Color palettes, These are the best because they're strong pigmented colours which can be built up in translucent layers, and once the alcohol evaporates off you can put more and more colours over the top, so you don't lose the colour of the Sculpt Gel underneath, but you can just tweak it with different layers. The other thing about alcohol activated makeups is that they're very durable and they resist moisture. They're only activated by 99% alcohol. Here you can see I'm rubbing the colour with my finger. No colour comes away, but when I spray 99% alcohol on there, it instantly comes back to life and can be applied. So think of them as watercolour paints, only using alcohol instead of water, basically. I mean, the stuff is endlessly able to be reactivated by the addition of alcohol at any time. This dried colour on a tile, you can see it doesn't smudge when I rub it, but if I spray a little alcohol on there, it comes back to life again, and it allows you to rework it endlessly until the alcohol evaporates off again. You can also use grease paints or cream-based makeup such as these, but again, you want to thin these with alcohol or surgical spirit so that you can apply them as a liquid rather than as a greasy kind of smear that you kind of drag on using a brush. So here I'm using a little bit of alcohol with grease paint. I'm making this red into a thin wash of colour, and that allows me to add tiny amounts of red, or the tiny amounts of red necessary to the Sculpt Gel surface to make it match the skin that's next to it. Remember, we don't need to add an actual skin coloured makeup because you've got the skin base colour from the pre-mixed pigment in the Sculpt Gel. At this stage I just want to tweak the colour gently so that the difference between the pigmented Sculpt Gel and the skin which is surrounding it is minimised by adding in just the missing mottled colours, which are very, very slight. It's easy to add too much. So make the wash with a tiny amount of colour and build it up as necessary. You can build up layers of colour. Don't feel like you have to do it in one go. When applying makeup, it's best to get your colours on whilst keeping contact with the surface to a minimal, and there are a few different ways of doing this. Now, the first way to do this is to use a round paintbrush like this, which has been stamped out on a tabletop, and you just keep stamping it down onto a tabletop and basically destroy the brush so that it flares out, and it creates a better shape for applying skin colours. Regardless of whether you're using grease paints or alcohol activated colours, the point is to place thin washes of colour onto the surface to create a stippled mottle effect like this to break up the solid block of single colour. So keep the brush moving and don't touch the surface more than you need to. If you apply thin washes of colour lightly, and if you're using a solvent like alcohol, it's very easy to accidentally disturb the previous layers underneath and unintentionally wipe them off. So to avoid this, touch the brush down on one particular spot and then move the brush to somewhere else in the piece and so on, and just keep the brush moving around. Just keep it dancing basically. So you don't touch the brush down onto a wet area, you let the alcohol evaporate away first. And it also helps to rotate the brush ever so slightly when you're using it so that you don't sort of create a repeated brush pattern. All this rotating and skipping around, that's why I call it a dancing brush, and it's a very effective way of laying on very, very subtle colours in a nice random looking fashion. So the next colouring technique I use is flicking the colours on. Now ideally this is done with a cut down cheap house painting brush, sometimes known as a chipwood brush or a chip brush, but you could actually use a toothbrush for the same effect. Regardless of what you use, applying thinned layers of colour by dipping the bristles into a thin wash, which you create by adding some alcohol to a little bit of makeup, and then flicking this onto the makeup and skin. Now, whilst holding the brush in one hand, gently stroke the bristles back with the other, flicking the colour onto the surface. Now, it's a good idea to keep some white tissue so that you can check the density of the colour that's on the brush before applying it to the makeup. If you just touch the brush onto the tissue, you'll see how dense the colour is before you sort of flick it on and accidentally put too much on. But after a while, you will get a feel for how much pigment to alcohol you need. Now, a good exercise to try this out before ruining any makeups is to actually try mixing up some washes and then flicking them onto some white card so that you can clearly see how much alcohol and pressure to use to create a lighter or heavier effect. Now, you can get a huge range from barely visible to very hard specks of colour and everywhere in between using this technique. I really like this technique. It's really good because it doesn't actually involve you touching the surface. So you can build up You can paint away building up colours and layers of colour without disturbing the previous ones if you're careful. It's just worth allowing the alcohol or the solvent you're using to evaporate before you apply the next layer. If you add too much, it may start to run, so it's handy to keep some sponge in one hand just to dab away any excess before it starts making a mess. Just make sure that you take care to cover up any costume or clothing or iPods or watches or whatever else you don't want to get covered in mess, because it's very easy to accidentally get this stuff everywhere if you're not careful. Now, the subject of airbrushes could fill a whole DVD on its own. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Rest assured, they're not crucial for these kinds of makeups. They're handy, certainly, but they're not essential by any means. Now, I've only used the airbrush in a couple of makeups in this series quite deliberately to demonstrate that you can get by without them. I don't want you to feel that you can't proceed without having an airbrush. Airbrushes are great, I love them, but it is possible to do a bad makeup with a great airbrush. They are just tools. So this is the kit I'm using currently, which is I have an Iwata Eclipse HPCS, which means nothing to me. I just bought it because a lot of my friends had similar airbrushes and I thought they were very, very good. I've had this for about 10 years and I love it. It works really well. I have modified the back. This little nut that's on the back is there. It basically restricts the needle movement going backwards, so I can kind of control how much comes out of the airbrush. You can actually buy a handle with this on already. What is great about an airbrush is that you don't need to make contact with the surface of the makeup, so you can apply mists of colour like this, and they dry very quickly as well because it's a thin mist. The solvent can evaporate very quickly and you can build up nice layers of colour. And they're great for very large areas too, and veins and things like that. Anything we need like a blurry kind of misty look. The downside is that they can be quite expensive, and not only that, but they need an air source such as a compressor, which again is another cost to consider, and they take a fair bit of cleaning in between colours. So if you're going to be using 3 or 4 different colours on a makeup, you've got to actually flush out the airbrush in between each colour. So there are downsides as well as positives. A lot of stage bloods are made with sugar or corn syrup, food grade dyes, and they're thinned with water. Now, this means that they can bead up on the surface of silicone or Sculpt Gel or on grease-based makeups, and this beading up is known as reticulation, and this happens because the oil-based surface, because Sculpt Gel is basically a silicone product and silicons tend to be very waterproof, it kind of beads up. And it's a dead giveaway that the effect underneath is fake. So to overcome this, you can add a drop of dishwashing detergent to a small amount of the blood, or if you want, apply it gently to the surface before applying your blood, and this will allow the water-based blood to sit better on the silicone surface. If you're using blood which is going to be used in the mouth, it's best not to put the washing up liquid directly in the big bottle, in case someone takes that and ends up using it in the mouth, which is pretty disgusting. To remove Sculpt Gel once it's cured, it's easiest to find an edge by rubbing a wet wipe or a face cloth over it to lift it up. It should peel away from skin relatively easily, although it may bond better to hair, so be careful at first. You can use wet wipes or makeup remover if necessary to clean the skin of makeup. Now, some redness due to the rubbing of the surface of the skin is quite normal during removal, and it should settle down. If you find yourself having to remove some Sculpt Gel which hasn't set, say if you accidentally mixed 2 parts A together, then you need to scrape the excess off with a tool and then clean the skin with wet wipes. And remember, if you've used any prosthetic glues when repairing edges, then be sure to use an appropriate remover when taking it off. Okay, so that's the key skills and techniques for using Sculpt Gel successfully. Now let's walk you through some specific makeups so that you can see these techniques applied in various ways. Okay, this first section of makeups takes a look at creating some gory wounds caused by blades and bullets. I think these are good ones to start out with, simply because if things don't go quite to plan, you can still put some blood on there and have something that looks pretty effective. Hopefully this will then build your confidence to try more effects, which will gradually need less and less blood. Just so you know, all of these makeups use a simple mix of 1 part A, 1 part B and 1 part C, just to keep things simple. If you want the mix softer, then you simply add more part C. Okay, we'll kick off with a cut cheek on Lauren here, which starts with the mouth corner, and it's sometimes known as a Chelsea smile or a Glasgow grin. Now I'm going to do this on one side only, but it looks pretty gruesome on both sides too. So I first mix up a batch of Sculpt Gel to match Lauren's base colour, and get it onto the cheek as quickly as possible to give you the most amount of working time. It's important to get the Sculpt Gel onto the actual lips, as the incision will be starting from the corner. Blend the edges out, leaving the thickest area in the middle, which will eventually be the incision. I sketch out the rough incision quite early on. The incision is looking a little bit wide at the start, but it will be nudged more closed when I start to sponge the surface. And I do that using surgical spirit on a sponge. Start blocking out the skin texture. I start texturing quite early on and can still smooth out the edges with the tool at this point. I sharpen up the end of the incision as it starts to set up, so that it looks more like it's been cut by a sharp blade. The cut will fill with blood, and this very thin tail at the end will look deeper than it is. I've also added a secondary little laceration under here just to add to the effect. You can see just touching those edges as it nearly sets with the tool will allow you to create sharper, crisper edges. I sponge the surface until it nearly sets, and that's pretty much it for the Sculpt Gel. I sponged on some anti-shine just to make the surface matte, and use a hairdryer gently to set the gel off. I'm now ready to start colouring. Starting with a smallish brush, I apply a very thin wash of red to put the warmth back all over. And then for the lip, I add some pink with a little blue and yellow, just to get that lip area back, to put the colour back where we've covered it with the Sculpt Gel. Next I add some blood red colour into the incision. Now I will be using blood, and you can just go straight in there with blood if you like, but sometimes if the blood is liquid and it runs out, then the paler skin here will be seen underneath. I have some thick blood paste which I put into the wound. Now this stuff isn't runny, so I can establish where I want the darkest areas to remain, and sponging this around helps it look messy and more natural and realistic. I do like to mop up the blood with a scrunched up tissue, as it stops the blood from looking like it's been carefully applied, which sometimes can undo a nice makeup. If the blood looks like it's been placed there very theatrically, then it can look a bit fake. I use some more liquid blood and move it around a bit, and then have a couple of runs coming down from the cut. The darkness inside the mouth corner will hide it, and this should appear as if the cut goes all the way through. I also thought it would be quite good to have a bit of blood that would have come out the nose. I reasoned that some blood would have been swallowed and choked up, so I thought it would be pretty gross to have some coming out the nose and running down from the nose to give it a bit more impact. And there you go, one Chelsea smile. Okay, so following on from that Chelsea smile, we'll do something similar but on a hand. Hands have textures that are not found in the face, usually. And it's interesting to see that you can create these textures with a Sculpt Gel so that they blend in with the surrounding skin in a slightly different way. I start by mixing up a base to match Funmi's hand. Now, I started with a Caucasian flesh tone and added browns and reds to it until we got the right tone. We found we needed quite a lot of yellow to give it enough warmth. I apply the mix onto the hand and make a point of finishing the edge in this natural crease which all hands have. Now this makes sense because the edges of the sculpture are now less obvious. Now using a sponge and alcohol makes very short work of these few ridges that are left by the tool. Using a thin tool dipped into a little alcohol, I can sketch back some of the lines that are in the skin which have been covered by the Sculpt Gel. And then I'll sponge those to reduce them. I can also use a thin brush which has been dunked in surgical spirit to draw a few softer lines in too. Now at this stage, and before the material sets, we can carve the incision in and take away the necessary gel to create the depth. And I want a crisp, neat line in here, so I use a tool to harden the edge as it's setting up. Once I'm happy, it's time to get the hairdryer again and set this mix up completely. I use a little bit of anti-shine over the surface. And then I mix up a little clear Sculpt Gel and I add some white and yellow pigment to this to create this fatty colour. I run some red in there like I did with the cheek wound and then mix some blood coloured makeup with some dark brown makeup to make it look like dried blood. I let that run freely and then let it dry and it looks quite natural, like blood that's been there for a while and is now dried. Now, as well as using that stuff, I've also got some drying blood. This stuff goes on wet and it contains alcohol which then evaporates and leaves behind a darker, sort of dry, cakey looking sort of clot of blood, which looks nice and scabby. Then I pop some blood on the fingers and allow it to seep into the creases of the hand. And then to finish off, I drop some fresh stuff into the cut and let it move around like I did before to complete the effect. Now I've seen many smaller gunshot injuries done before, so I didn't want to show you something too small. I thought I showed you a larger, more dramatic wound, which you can then simply scale down if you want to do something smaller like an entry wound. Now, as with the hand incision and the fatty layer, we'll be doing this in a couple of mixes to create different tissues and build a more gory effect. As always, we start with a batch of Sculpt Gel with a base pigment close to Paul's skin. This time I want to create a crater which blends off at the edges, leaving a deep hole in the middle. Blend these edges out with long, smooth strokes. Now as soon as those edges are blended, I start to add the texture and nudge the tool marks out with a sponge. As it sets up, and using a tool, I can sharpen the edges to create some lacerations. With bits of sponge, I can lift up the set material and pack out some areas to create some distortion and regularity without having to add more Sculpt Gel. I mix up another batch of fatty colour Sculpt Gel and pop this into the cavity in the centre of the wound area. And as it sets, I can tool some texture in and smooth it back with alcohol and sponge. I also mix some blood coloured Sculpt Gel, sort of meaty tissue, to pack in there too. Now, you don't have to do this, you could put some blood in after the makeup's done, but I just thought it'd be nice to put a bit of blood colour into the Sculpt Gel to create a kind of a permanent sort of lumpy, meaty blood texture in there too. Running some blood coloured alcohol colours in there gets those nice runs which can then be mopped up and splattered around. Now this skin colour isn't quite right, so I want to sort of help it along. So to help match, I'm going to flick some like an olive green, a very light wash of olive green onto here to give it some yellowness, because it needs some yellow. And I don't want it to be too orange, and the olive green does it quite nicely. And then I flick a little bruisey kind of red colour over the top. Popping some thick and fresh blood in there and mopping it about completes the effect. And a few juicy runs of blood, and we're good to go. This wound is a little more extensive in terms of the area it covers, but it's actually not that thick. This wound is supposed to have been created by a shotgun from quite a close range, and involved the use of a shell which contained lots of little pellets. And that's what the little spread of holes is supposed to be around the centre. So I mix up some Sculpt Gel and spread it over quite a large area, like I said, trying to get those edges down as quickly as you can. I sponge this quickly to get the surface smoothed out, and then quickly dig out that centre to create the central defect. I sponge down the tool marks and then use the handle of a very small paintbrush dipped in alcohol to create the many holes from the shot. They should be grouped closer towards the centre. Get that all over, and then I dry this off lightly with a hairdryer, and then flick the same colour on over the top, build up another layer of this colour with a slightly different texture this time because it's been flicked on, and then go over this with a slightly pale flesh tone, and all of this kind of mottles it together so that it doesn't look like one single colour. It has a kind of a mix of all these different colours. I stipple a layer of anti-shine over the top to get it matte, and then put some black makeup into the hole just to make it look deeper. This is to literally just block out that pale skin that's in there that you can see, because obviously the hole in the middle touches down on his skin, so in order to stop that from showing, we cover that with black makeup first, and the blood that goes on top of that will kind of hide all that, but it just means we won't see any pale skin showing through. And then drop some dark red wash into each little hole with a brush. I stipple some red and bruise tones on here and there. Then pop some blood on and dab it around again just like before, just so that it's kind of messy and looks pretty blood soaked and nasty. So with the occasional messy run of blood, we have a nasty looking wound that looks like it needs some pretty urgent medical attention. So in Scars and Scabs, we're looking at more gentle effects which don't need any blood. And we'll start with a favourite which gets most people squirming, some rather juicy looking cold sores. Okay, I start with a small amount of a pale yellow mix, so it's a kind of like a nice pus kind of colour. This is quite translucent, so you want to mix some white and yellow pigments together until you get a nice kind of pale lemony kind of yellow colour with maybe a hint of red. And mix this up, and then I put a few sort of bigger blisters and some smaller ones nearby. So we put a big one around the nose and a big one on the lip, and then have a couple of little ones skirting around those. And then nudge the edges out with a cotton swab and some alcohol. Now take care near the nose with alcohol or surgical spirit. It may be easier if your subject breathes through their mouth. And also be aware of the ticklishness, because around the nose people get very ticklish, and that's inevitable. Sometimes people can sort of bounce around laughing because you're working near their nose, so bear that in mind. Now I add a little pinky red around the edge of those, a little pinky red makeup once it's set. Now you could leave it at this, but I want to crank it up a notch and make it a bit more gross. I mix up a little bit of Sculpt Gel, just A and B, I didn't add any C to this stuff, and mix into it some flock. And I'm going to add some yellow, red and brown flock, and quite a bit as well. Add a lot of flock to a tiny amount of Sculpt Gel, and you want to fill this stuff with the flock so it goes almost kind of dry, so it looks like a kind of a scab that you can move around. That's what you're after. And I'm not using any pigment, just flock, so it looks quite sort of fibrous and scab-like. And it's perfect for this kind of thing. And then basically I pop this around the blisters, and you can see there putting it around the nose and on the lips, and it just looks like dried kind of scabby sort of flaked off skin that you get on sort of healing wounds that are a bit weepy and a bit sore. And once you've done that, what you need to do is check for sensitivity with latex. Most people are okay with latex. Latex is used in a lot of sort of things, but there are people who are allergic to latex. So if you or your subject is one of them, then it's probably best to not use latex. But if you can use latex, it's great. And I'm adding a little bit of latex around the outside of the blister with a cotton swab here, just to keep it neat. It doesn't need to extend out too far from the wound. We want to do a very sort of thin sort of margin of latex around each blister. And then once this is dry, and you can dry that with a hairdryer to speed it up, once it's dry you can peel the inside out. So you sort of start at the blister and peel it away from the blister. Peel it out slightly from the blister to make it look like the skin's sort of healing and trying to heal, and it's peeling away from the blister in the middle. And once you've done that in a few places, try not to make it look too regular. Again, any kind of regularity or symmetry or sameness everywhere is going to look a bit fake. So if you keep it a little bit random here and there, and you know, some places more than others, it should look like a nasty bout of cold sores. So the technique to create scabs on the cold sore blisters can of course be used to create general scabs for sort of healing wounds of all kinds. Now, this scab on the back of my hand, for example, looks like a sort of a healing burn or similar kind of wound that's healing. So to do this, I mixed up before the same basically. You mix up some Sculpt Gel A and B, and you add red, yellow and brown flock. And obviously the more you add, the thicker and more scab-like it becomes. And then once you're done, pop the mixture in place quite quickly and tease the edges out. Now once the material's set up, we can peel and lift some of the edges. Scabs often lift at the edges because scabs aren't flexible, but skin is. So often if the skin, especially if it's on somewhere near a knuckle or a joint where the skin can move quite a lot, you can find that some of the edges kind of go white when they lift up. So if you lift up some of the edges with a tool, that can look quite realistic. And then I use a little bit of dark brown and a bit of blood colour makeup, and I dot it in a few places. And again around the edge, a little bit of latex around the scabs, which can be then dried and peeled back. So around the outside of the scab, to make it look a bit more sore, I apply a thin wash of a sort of a pinky red. I go a little heavier in a few places, and I'm using a very, very tiny brush. And take care not to use too much alcohol. If you put a lot of alcohol on latex that's been applied to the skin, it can kind of creep under the latex and make it lift, and it can peel away. So do go easy, don't put too much on at once. And there we go, a flexible scab, which should work with the skin and not sort of peel off, but it looks suitably scabby and sore. So you may need a few subtle veins for an age makeup, or a ton of them for a virus-infected gruesome zombie. Whatever you need them for, it's handy to be able to create them on the spot. So what I did was I mixed up some clear Sculpt Gel for this, and I used a little bit of blue and a little bit of red, only a tiny bit, to make a very sort of translucent purplish kind of colour. And then I place little lines of the mixture on the skin, and I would suggest that you don't do too many at once, because it's very easy to sort of lay on 20 or 30 veins, and then you've got to blend the edges out on all of them, and it may set before you've had a chance to do that. It's probably worth just sidestepping just a little bit here to show you a nice technique for doing veins, which I learned a while ago on a job, and it served me well over the years as a starting point for establishing vein patterns. I usually start with like a main central road like this, just a bigger vein, and that's the main sort of vein from which the others are going to feed off of. Try and make it a little bit snaky and wiggly in places. If you do it too straight, it can look more like a tree branch, so you want to give it a little bit of a wiggle here and there. So once you've got your main road, from that I then feed off a few smaller roads from that main one, and avoid the temptation to have dozens and dozens branching off. That's when it looks a little bit clumsy and a bit messy. Just stick to a few main ones and then sort of keep them on one side more than the other. Maybe add one or two on the other side, but bias should be on one side rather than the other. And that kind of principle has served me quite well. It's good for a nice sort of realistic base sort of vein pattern. So back to the makeup, using a brush or a cotton swab with a little alcohol is also very useful for blending out the edges without leaving tool marks in the way that a tool can. Because this is quite a delicate effect, you've got a very small amount of sort of area to blend things out. A sponge can then be used as before to flatten them out slightly. If you go too far and squash and flatten them out too much, you can always nudge it back with a tool and then try again with a sponge. So after another mix, I use a little bit of anti-shine, and then I add some vein colour, some vein makeup, like a kind of a pale bluey, kind of purpley wash, very, very thin wash. I use a tiny thin brush and paint in some thin lines that they come out from the Sculpt Gel and extend into the skin, which helps sort of extend the effect and kind of confuse where is the Sculpt Gel and what's colour, and you kind of merge them in. Also, the makeup's very good for going into the hairline like I have here, so that the veins don't suddenly stop at the hairline. You can actually paint into the hair, onto the scalp, through the hair, so you can just see them fade off into the hairline there. So for this scar, I'm using a little bit of standard Sculpt Gel, just the standard kit, which is a pretty good colour for David's skin. And I need only to mix up a tiny amount because I'm creating a very thin line, as with the vein, but this time it's going to be a little V shape. And I made one side of the V longer than the other side so that it doesn't look too symmetrical, and also taper the ends so they blend into the skin. And I start to nudge and tease out the scar into some interesting shapes here and there as it sets up. So once it's set, I add tiny dabs of a bruisey pinky tone around the edge of the skin. The trick is not to make the colour too strong and not to make it too even. You don't want a sort of an even halo of pink around the outside, as that's going to look fake. And there you go, you're ready for your audition as a James Bond villain. So let's imagine the incised cheek cut that we done on Lauren earlier is now healed, and let's take a look at what it would look like. Essentially, we need to build up the cheek so that we can have a deep crease in the center of it as before. So what I'm going to do is mix up and apply a batch with a skin tone in it to suit Lauren's color. It's applied exactly as the cheek cut. The only difference is going to be that the edges of the wound won't be so sharp, and we won't be using any blood, so we have to do a good job of getting these edges down. In some areas, I use a tool dipped into the alcohol to smooth out some specific areas. And once you've done that, then smooth it out with a sponge. Now in the scar crease, I put some pinky red tones in and then used a flared brush to lightly stipple some red into the Sculpt Gel surface just to kind of help it tone in with the skin. Then it's just a quick dose of anti-shine and the scar is done. So this pockmarked kind of skin is a subtle effect, and it could be made more severe or extreme if necessary. The trick is to not build up the Sculpt Gel layer too thickly. So I apply the mix as usual, following just behind where the laughter line would be, and I go down to the jawline and finish above around the cheek area. So it's quite a large area that it's covering. Now it's very important to get this flat and down quite quickly, so I use a flat bladed tool in long sort of smooth strokes, and I build up probably only about 2mm at the thickest in the middle. Now long before it sets, I can give it a quick sponge with some alcohol and then use a wooden spatula to rough out the indentations and marks. There's still quite a bit of time before this stuff cures, but it's a good idea to establish where these are now. So as it sets, I start to harden up a few of the scars so they look a bit sharper. Now the stuff's nearly set, I can drop a tiny amount of pinky bluestone into some of the marks and then flick a tiny amount of red and olive kind of colour makeup on to help tie in with the natural skin around it. And sometimes all the hair drying and the prodding and the sponges and all that kind of stuff can cause redness because you're sort of touching the skin constantly. So be aware that some of that redness may fade after sort of 20 minutes after the makeup's finished. So it's easy to put too much red in thinking that's the colour of the skin, and half an hour later it's actually too red because their skin settled down. So take it easy with the reds, you can always add more. It just needs a little bit of anti-shine or powder and you're away. And if you're going for real acne scarring, don't forget to do the other cheek too. Now, this scar is based on a healed burn which has created sort of a raised webbing texture known as hypertrophic scarring. This makeup is not thick. It's easy to pile tons and tons on thinking that you're going to get a more dramatic effect, but actually keeping it thinner and flatter will make it look more convincing. So I start with a skin tone which is slightly paler than Lauren's, and I establish a few main lines where I want the webbing to occur. So on some of the lines I create a harder edge here and there. These will help create the webbed look of the skin being pulled tight, and let this set totally before adding the next mix. The next mix is a different colour, it's paler and pinkier, and I apply the lines as before. Some of these lines will cut across the previous mix, which is why you need the first mix to have gone off completely before you apply the second. And some of these lines are going to be different lengths as well. The same rules apply. If everything's the same, it's going to look too contrived. So some lines are longer than others, just to kind of give it a bit more kind of natural randomness. So we blend these out, and when it sets up you can gradually add lines into the surface with a tool or a wooden stick like I am here. These tiny ridges and lines add a very nice layer of subtle texture that also help kill the shine too. So I don't want the scar to suddenly stop, but I want it to sort of fade out here and there. So there's always a bit of a gradual shift from the healthy skin into what's supposed to be the damaged sort of skin and scar tissue. Often with burns, the heat will cause the skin to contract. If you've ever watched a piece of bacon or some meat in a frying pan, you can see how it shrinks up with the heat. The skin will contract with the heat, and that can pull on the healthy skin that's next to it, which is why you often end up with these kind of webbed areas that look like they're under tension. I start by plotting some pinky reds here and there. Now these can be blended using alcohol so that the colour fades out as it creeps away from the lines of webbing. Then I flick on a flesh tone to help knock this back and help make the colour appear as if it's under the skin rather than on the surface. So over this I use my big fluffed up brush to apply a yellowy tan colour in places. Now looking at pictures of the real thing, I've often noticed that burn scars have a kind of a tan type kind of discoloration here and there. So I put a few of those in. A little bit more anti-shine where it's needed, and that's the makeup finished. We'll kick off this part with a blood blister. Blood blisters are ugly things that usually happen on hands or feet, usually from getting the skin pinched or rubbed. And I thought a decent blood blister on the ball of the foot would be a good place to start. So the first thing I need to do is mix up a decent blood blister colour. I mixed up the colour using a purple that I made using red and blue to make purple in pure pigment, and then added a touch of Caucasian skin tone to that. And then added a little bit of yellow and a bit of blue to get this kind of raw liver colour. I put the gel in place and quickly establish a rounded but irregular shape. Now on this one I don't touch the edges, I simply want to get a smooth surface as quickly as possible, so I go in with a sponge and alcohol to round off the blister, but without losing the thickness. The sponge texture here it will relax as the gel settles, it's still quite soft here. Using a hairdryer to set up the mix, now I can mix up a little bit of Sculpt Gel with some flesh tone, and I put a few lines and a few blobs of this flesh tone Sculpt Gel on the surface here and there just to help blend them out. And this is to sort of represent the skin on the surface. You don't have to add it if you don't want to, but I kind of like that look. I added a pinky wash around the skin to make the blister look a bit more painful. I also added a blood colour in places over the Sculpt Gel just to help break that up. And then I applied a heavy amount of anti-shine over this because this stuff dries to quite a powdery finish if you put a lot on, and it appears quite blue, which suits the blood blister quite well. And there you go, your finished blister. Obviously a standard blister could also use the same methods, the only difference really is the colour and the density of colour. Here I've got a blister on the heel using a paler yellowy mix. Pretty much the same method but just with a paler colour. Again, sponging with the alcohol did 90% of the work. I didn't really touch this too much with a tool, I just used the sponge. And then a little bit of redness around the edge will help with that soreness. So if you wanted a more translucent sort of effect, you could just use less pigment in there. And obviously the other thing that you could do here, which I haven't done, is to put a couple of layers of latex around the edge and then dry those and peel those back, like we did on the scabs. Again, if the skin's been rubbed enough to cause a blister, then you could conceivably have sort of rubbed skin around there, which hasn't blistered, but there's still evidence of the damage there on the heel. So that's something else you could do to add another layer to the effect. So scalds are burns usually caused by hot fluids, and so they tend to happen in different areas than flame burns, which we'll look at soon. The first thing I'm going to do is mix up the deeper tissue colours first. So I make a very pink pale skin colour and smear this onto the shoulder. I smooth it out and use a hairdryer to set this off completely. Now over this area I apply a very thin layer of Vaseline, being careful to not get any on the skin. You only want to get it on the Sculpt Gel. Next I apply a mix which is closer to Paul's skin tone, and I put this on the skin around the edge and overlap it onto the pink Sculpt Gel as well. And the Vaseline that's underneath should stop the two from sticking. Blend the skin edges into the skin and leave the edges on the inside rough. I stipple a blood red colour into the central area and tone in the skin with some flaked red and olive to help match Paul's skin. Next I stipple latex over the middle area and dry it. And then I stipple some around the skin with latex and dry that too. Then I peel away the dried latex from the Sculpt Gel to create a peeling thin layer of skin effect. The set skin colour Sculpt Gel around the edges, that can be lifted away because it's not sticking because of the Vaseline, and you can create sort of cool little folds and tears on the edges with those little loose bits of skin. I do a bit more colour blending and add an angry looking sort of red to help the scald look a bit more sort of vicious and severe, and mix up some yellow gel, yellow food dye, mix that with a bit of KY jelly, and you've got a very nice kind of the goo that you get inside blisters, that kind of liquid, that yellowy liquid, that's very good. We can put that under the latex to create blisters, and it also gives the scald a nice shine. And adding a touch of blood here and there will help too. And voila, one scalded shoulder extra moist. Okay, the full thickness burn caused by fire looks different but uses similar techniques but with a different colour scheme. So like the scald, this starts with a pale yellow mix applied first in areas, I try to keep it random and natural looking, so there's little patches of this colour along the arm. The second mix goes on, which is bright pink, and I apply that in the same way, in a kind of random kind of fashion. And then next I mix a larger batch of Sculpt Gel, which is closer to Lauren's skin tone. It's not spot on, but it's close enough for what we want here. And then build up areas just like we did with the Sculpt. The idea is to keep the pink and the yellow areas that we put on first, keep those exposed so that they will appear to be the deeper tissues under the skin surface. And then make sure the edges into the skin, they blend into the skin, and stipple them out just as always, just to get a nice smooth blend, so there's no transition from the skin to the Sculpt Gel. After this is set, I decide to add some brown gel, similar to the Scab mix, but just not as dense in colour. Again, to kind of help break this up, we're now sort of creating a burned kind of look, which we'll do with makeup. But this kind of brown Sculpt Gel kind of helps get that sort of parched, burnt skin kind of effect here and there. Now what I'm doing here is I'm actually applying pieces of torn and scrunched up tissue paper, and the reason I'm putting those in is because I want those to be like little bits of crispy skin later on. So when we put the colour on those, they should start looking like sort of burnt, wispy, sort of overly barbecued skin. So it's time to put colour on now, and I'm going to use reds, brown and black. Now if you're too careful, it's going to look neat and artificial, so you need to be quite sloppy almost. Now for this makeup I am using an airbrush because I want to apply a misty layer of brown and black, which often happens with smoke. You get that kind of smoke look and you get that carbon deposit that's sort of left in the air that can kind of scorch a large area. So I want to put a little bit of this on with an airbrush just to kind of mist it off in a few places. Once I've done that, I stipple some latex in some areas, like we did before, and dry this with a hairdryer. And then once the latex is dried, I can peel the latex away in places, and then that creates another level of sort of peeling skin. It also peels the colour away, which is quite nice because it leaves clean, paler areas of skin underneath, as if the skin's peeled away to reveal a kind of that sort of shiny, clean surface underneath. And finally, I add a few finishing touches. Now I like to use a charcoal powder, which is literally black charcoal dust, which you can get from makeup suppliers. And that brushes on very nicely. And the nice thing about it is that it's matte, just like the real bones. They get very matte and very sort of carbonized. And then to contrast that, inside the sort of very raw areas of skin underneath where the black isn't, I'm putting a little bit of KY jelly just to kind of get that wet shine that you get in there using a brush. And also a tiny bit of blood here and there is quite nice. That mixes in quite nicely. And then you've got that nice contrast between the sort of the moisture of that wet sort of meat in the middle that's been exposed, and the outside is that dried, burnt skin. So there's a very nice mix of the two colours and textures and contrasts. And it's quite a striking effect. And there you have one severe full thickness burn on the arm.